Hello students, thank you for tuning in. This is your next video from your anonymous post-its in class, and these are all the category of student behavior. So there seems to be quite a bit of concern over how to deal with unwanted student behavior, and there are several questions that are all pretty different, so I'm going to go ahead and read them. The first one: are there ways or methods to assume that every student in your class feels supported? How do you make sure you're not giving too much time and energy to a small group of students? I think this is a very good question. A lot of new teachers end up focusing only on the students who make the most noise, ask the most questions, raise their hand a lot, or blurt things out in class, or struggle academically, perhaps. So I think it's important to find some methods to randomly call on students when you want them to participate. A lot of teachers use the popsicle stick method, things like that are good. I think it's important to use a seating chart and intentionally visit each part of your classroom. And as you do that, in the beginning, until you get a habit of it, make a note to yourself, each group you talk to or each area of the room that you went to. And I think that can really help you. So if you carry around a clipboard and you have your seating chart, as you call on students, as you visit that group, as you work with one-on-one or in a small group of students, you can make a little check mark for yourself and then look at it at the end of the day to see how many times you talk to that area or that group of students. I think that's important to try out because that's the sort of thing that will make sure that you're not unintentionally paying all your attention to one or two students who seem to have the most need, because often you'll be ignoring kids who do have a lot of need but just are not asking for it. The next question: how do you teach a child who argues or is stubborn? And there's an example given of the student who was working with a child and the child was pronouncing something wrong, and even though she tried to help her and correct her, she refused to go along with it. So in this sort of circumstance, don't spend all your time arguing with a student. You never want to argue with students. As the adult, that doesn't set a good example. You make your one statement about what is the correct answer and move on. If the kid refuses to accept it, that's okay. They'll come around eventually. You can still mark their paper wrong. When they get it wrong, you can correct them again, but you don't need to get into a verbal back and forth with a student. It's just not worthwhile. It doesn't set a good example, and it doesn't actually teach the student anything other than this person is willing to argue with me, which is probably what's really going on there. It probably has nothing to do with the actual answer, but more the child's need to claim your attention and hog your attention for a period of time. So I would not reward that with any kind of a back and forth argument or get into trying to prove something to a child. I would just tell them the right answer, correct it, make sure they understand, and even if they say, no, it's not it, you just say, we're moving on, and that's it. The next question: how do I deal with students that are causing trouble in the middle of lectures without having to stop the lecture or interrupt the class? So this depends on the level of interruption. If this is a small interruption, then you just learn to keep going. And once you redirect the rest of the class on an independent activity or a small group activity, then their attention is elsewhere, not you. You can walk over to that individual student and correct their behavior and ask them to stop that. That's the best way to do it. So let's say, for example, you're teaching, you're doing a short lecture on something. Short is the key. You should never be doing a long lecture to children. They will not be able to listen. The general rule is how old they are is how many minutes they can concentrate on something. So if you're talking to a group of 7-year-olds, you've got about 7 minutes to get your point across, and then you're going to start losing them. And for some students, it may be less. Keep that in mind as well. So you have a short lecture going and you have a student who's making some noise, tapping their pencil or blurting out answers, whatever you might see as a normal interruption. You can give a signal, something like this, putting your finger out, giving them a quiet signal just to tell them this is not appropriate. And then you continue with your lecture. Tell everybody else when you're done with that 5-minute set of instructions or modeling, whatever you're doing, okay, now I want you to take out your assignment. I want you to start working on this problem. Talk with your partner about what you think of this question. What do you think the answer might be? Write down what you think, whatever. You get them busy doing something, And then you walk over to that student and you privately say, I don't appreciate you interrupting. Next time I want you to raise your hand, or I want you to stay quiet when it's not your turn. And then if that continues over and over, then you follow up with another consequence. If it is a very large interruption that everyone cannot ignore, and you'd be surprised how much kids can learn to ignore after a while once they are around each other for a while. But if it is something that big, then you can stop your lecture. And I would say you still want to speak privately with the student as best you can. A quiet one-on-one conversation is always going to calm the student down and redirect behavior better than outing them or arguing with them or calling them out in front of people. You don't want to do that. If they feel like they're embarrassed in front of their friends, then you are much lower on the list of people they want to listen to. So you want to keep that in mind. I would always suggest maybe pulling the kid outside the door to talk to them privately, maybe give them a little breather or 5 minutes in a neighbor's classroom to calm down if it's something that they're upset about. If it's just the kid having bad habits of yelling things out, then I would say start a tally of every time they do it right, not every time they do it wrong. Give them a little checklist and tell them every time they raise their hand and wait for their turn to put a mark. And then your goal is to get 5 of those in a day or 10 or whatever. And pretty soon you'll see the kid wants to get more of those. And sometimes they'll just raise their hand because they want to be able to mark it, but that's okay. They're practicing the right behavior. So that's a good way to address that. The next question is, how do you rationale restraining a student when they are a danger to you and other students? Okay, so this is a pretty rare scenario, but if you believe you have a student in your class that is a physical danger to you or others, and this has become apparent, I would definitely first tell your administrator your concern. Talk about the behaviors you've seen, why you believe this is an issue. Start documenting everything that happens. Every time the child demonstrates any kind of behavior that you think is dangerous, write it down, tell your administrator right away, fill out the referral to the office, make sure that you follow up on that. If you do not follow up with paperwork, then it's almost like it didn't happen. You must document everything. In that moment, you have to use your best judgment. I would definitely avoid that kind of contact with students at all costs if possible. Unless you really believe that another child is going to be injured, then I would not touch a child in any manner to restrain them if possible. I would move the other kids out of the area, and I've heard of even the most extreme case is you get everybody else out of the class and you just leave the kid in there. If they're wigging out, then you just leave them in there to wig out, and you don't restrain them because you could end up hurting them or yourself in that process, and that's really not what you want. So just be very clear with your administrators about your concerns and what you've seen if you see that kind of issue, and at all costs just remove the other children from the area and yourself, and only use that kind of situation of restraining them when you feel like you have no other choice in that moment. You do have a right to do that when you feel like that's the situation, but I would always avoid that if possible. For example, when I taught middle school, on multiple occasions, if there's a fight breaking out in the lunch area or in the hallway, the first thing we do is not jump in the middle of the fight or try to pull back kids from a fight. The first thing we do is remove all the other kids from the area. 9 times out of 10, if all the other kids are gone, they'll stop fighting. They're showing off for somebody else, so that's probably going to help. If the kid is just kind of chaotically flailing around, then you just want to get away from them and get all your other students out of the area. Okay, next question. What are appropriate consequences for bad student behavior or breaking the rules? There are a lot of options here. I am a big fan of personal goal setting and keeping it more positive than negative, but I do think you need to have some consequences. I think the consequences need to be appropriate for the rule breaking. So if my rule that I broke is that I didn't clean up my area and everything's a mess, the consequence should be cleaning. If it is being rude to another student, my consequence should be talking about that and addressing it and coming to an authentic, honest apology, hopefully. These are the kinds of things to think about, that the consequence doesn't have to be punishment. It has to help you learn the right way to behave. So a consequence should be a kid engaging in a positive action, not sitting and staring at the wall, not sitting on timeout. I'm not a big fan of those because it doesn't really teach you how to act. It just gives a punishment for how not to act. And so think of consequences and discipline as practicing something like the right behavior. So we talk about what we want students to do. We provide opportunities for them to practice that. I'm a really strong advocate against the pocket chart system. I think a lot of my students know that. I really don't like them. I think that asking a kid to put their name on the wall or write their name on the board or walk across the room and change a color and show the world that they are misbehaving is humiliating, and it's a process that adults would never put up with, and I don't think we should ask children to be humiliated in front of their peers either. So you need to be thinking about the kinds of consequences that can be positive, help the kid learn, and leave with the kid feeling good about trying to show some improvement, not leaving the situation angry, because that will not help anybody learn. Okay? I would always also recommend that you keep track of progress. So if you're working with a kid who has trouble breaking the rules, keep track of their progress, how many times they're doing it, how many times they're doing it right, hopefully, and send home positive notes to reinforce that. I think that that's the best way to correct those kinds of behaviors. Okay, that is it for this stack of Post-it notes. Thank you, and there is one more to follow on parents and families.